Welcome to the podcast, Zoe. It's so nice to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Um, Feels like the direction is going to be very psychological, sense making, and just the dynamics of being in groups of people, making sense of what's going on, trusting your own experience, intuition, all that stuff. Super excited. You wrote a recent Twitter thread that gained some popularity on reality distortion fields, and I think what was it called? The humility of accepting you had
You've been manipulated or something like that?
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it really got me thinking, and that's actually why I ended up reaching out to you, was because I saw that thread and it just really kind of moved me in a certain way. I was like, whoa, like this matches up with my experience in a way that not very many other people have really written about. And so I'm very curious to hear how you're understanding the term reality distortion field, or like what that is, or just how you're sensing into that at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. So I do think it's I've actually been trying since you asked me about this to be like, what is a simple answer to that question?
Mm,
And it's very hard to find the boundaries of it. And yet it's a very real thing. And I think
right.
that points to that says something about what it is, that it's hard to describe. That is in the nature of what a reality distortion field is that it's hard but not impossible to describe. um, there's something obscuring about it. Like, I'm now sort of like describing some phenomenological features. um, the source is often obscured, and there's a certain strangeness to
Right.
reality distortion fields. There's a certain foreignness, a strangeness, um, a reality shift. Like, you've entered a
Mm,
slightly different or enormously different world than you thought you were in. Um,
right.
and often the way in which it's different, you can't quite name, you can't articulate, but you know
Yeah.
it's different. Um, so, I mean, I have like an underlying model of kind of the mechanics of reality distortion fields that kind of rests on sort of Jungian Freudian unconscious, and that it's an interaction between people's unconscious minds of a very particular kind.
Mm,
Um, and I think that the outcomes can be very different in terms of what everybody's reality distortion field feels different. Any person who has one, I guess, not to like overly reify it,
mm,
it's going to have a different impact. I can talk a bit about what I think is happening in the interaction there. That's kind of what I tweeted about.
mhm. Yeah, I think I could add a little bit of content that may spark you a bit and take you in a direction. So, just personal experience. I had this experience of going to a community, and one of the stories that was developing as the first couple weeks that I joined this community was that it felt like a culture shock. It felt
Mm,
like last year I traveled through Central America for like 6 months, and it was a pretty easy transition to just go into a new country, travel. And the story that I had about this community was that this felt like more of a culture shock than going to a third world country. Like I was like, whoa, what is happening? Like this is just like, and
mhm.
I now that you say that, it feels like a little bit of a reality distortion shift. And I was like, what is this? Is a completely different way of living. This is a completely different way of relating to the world. I feel
Mhm.
more like it was very strong around existential risk. So I felt like this strong, like, oh, the world is gonna end in the next 2 years kind of
Wow.
feeling. And then
Wow.
it was
Yeah.
just like, but that felt like true in that container. It was like, this is how the world is and this is how the world works. And yeah, and I was struggling to
Yeah.
process that sudden shift into that different way of viewing things. And it was almost that everyone in the community was like subtly agreeing upon things about how the world works that like people in like culture like didn't, or like there was like subtle ways in which, oh yeah, this is how the world is. And I was like, what do you mean this is how or I don't know, it's very subtle. And like
Yeah.
you said, it was very hard to pinpoint what it actually was. But I'm
Yeah.
curious, yeah, if you can take that anywhere and go into
Yeah.
like the mechanics of that maybe.
Yeah, that sounds like exactly kind of the experience, right? And I don't know if you felt this, but and oftentimes you find yourself sort of accepting this
Mm,
as true, but
yeah.
not necessarily fully consciously. You're like, oh, often the experience is like, oh, I didn't know the world was like that, but obviously
Yeah.
it is. Oh, it turns out I was wrong about all of those things. And this is the
Right.
truth. There's often a feeling of like, oh, I found the truth,
Mm.
That's a good sign, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't see before, but now I do.
Mm.
This is maybe not worth referencing because I can't remember the details, but James Carson, Finite and Infinite Games, has a great, uh, very small bit that's often brushed over about conversion experiences, and how these are, you're not actually getting outside of a finite game. You're just switching. You're like flipping to a new one. You're like, now I found the truth. Anyway, there's something there. I have to remember to look up. Yeah, there's a switch in your experience of what's real or what's important or what's significant. Often your expectations about what will happen, sometimes in a global sense, suddenly change,
Mm.
you know? And there's often somewhere implicitly inside of this a bunch of hidden blockers that sort of defend the new ideology
Right.
from questioning, right? Where there'll be these really implicit things that's like, well, obviously the world's going to end in 2 years from AI. And then there's something really subtle where it's like, and if I don't believe that, it's because I'm behind and I just don't get it yet, or something like
Mm.
this, right? There
Right.
will
Right.
be a narrative snuck in there implicitly about who are the people who don't believe this and why they're wrong or dumb or unevolved, or
Mm.
listening too much to their thoughts and not to their inner wisdom, or listening too much to their irrational mind and not enough critical thinking. Like there's going to be something in there. So
Right.
the really strong reality distortion fields are also part of the field, is a defense of the field that's built in, where it's like a very good rhetorical argument that catches all of your opposition and concerns, um, early on,
Mm.
basically. And most of it's happening implicitly, which makes you even less defended, right?
Right.
Um, and via a lot of like sort of social maintenance mechanisms. Well, all of a sudden I'm absorbed in this kind of insular world and everybody believes this.
Mm.
That itself just has a giant effect on the human psyche. Um, and then, I mean, now we're getting into like stuff that's been written about cult dynamics, and not to say it's always a cult when these things happen.
Mm.
Um, but the insularity is often key, and this
Right.
setting yourself apart from those outside, a sense of elitism or difference, uniqueness, specialness,
Right.
that sets
Right.
you up perfectly to fall into this new world.
Yeah, it feels like the isolation is huge.
Yeah.
Like if you don't have any communication or contact or cross-referencing with the outside world, it feels very easy to just get stuck in these loops and get stuck in these ideologies and these reality distortion fields.
Yeah.
Something that was coming up was like, yeah, there was in this experience I had, there was this one narrative of like, if you aren't able to handle the intensity of training, then it's because you're not ready. Right? It's like
Hmm.
we do some
Perfect.
serious spiritual training here, like hours
Yeah.
and hours a day of meditation.
Oh,
If you're
yeah.
not able to handle that, then it's because you're not ready yet, and you'll be ready
Yeah.
someday.
Classic. Classic. So classic. Yeah. Yeah. It's a built-in motivation to get you
Mm,
striving, kind of,
right, right.
right?
Hmm.
I want to be ready, you know.
Hmm.
um, I want to be spiritually developed. It'll play on our sense of uh, significance or importance, our desire to better
Right.
ourselves.
Yeah. And there's something here around, I don't fully understand the concept of finite and infinite games, but
Yeah.
I've done a little bit of reading on it. I haven't actually read the full book, but it almost felt like this, an infinite game being that which is never ending, contributing to that finite. And it's like there was this certain narrative that like we're doing the infinite game here, and you can go back out to society and all the finite games,
Uh-huh.
and you can do all the consumerism and the chasing
Yeah.
money and all those finite games and just trying to win those games. But like this is like the infinite game. This is like the trying to unlock, you know, the nature of suffering or something like that, and like using a
Yeah.
lot of Buddhist ideas, but like kind of co-opting them for something that was very interesting.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I'm curious how you relate the cult dynamics with the finite infinite game stuff, or if you've made some
Mm.
correlations between those.
Well, I have. Let me think about it. It's a slightly different mapping than what they were, which doesn't surprise me. Um, um, Let me think for a minute. Something I wrote down, by the way, was insularity is not good for epistemology, which is a
Mm,
good little motto to keep in the back of one's mind. Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that's popping to mind for me actually is so I read that book right as I was leaving a group that I was part of, that I derived a lot of these models from that experience. And it was really key in helping me process all of that
mm,
in ways I don't even fully still understand why it was so essential. I think there's something about goal orientedness which is central to a cult mindset. Outcomes are predetermined in a way that they are in finite games, or the desirable outcome is predetermined. Who you should be,
right.
what the world should be, what is bad, what is good, um, what mental psychological state you're aiming for that is the right way to be a person,
Right.
that is the most good way to be a person. Other people do it another way, but this is the best way.
Right.
um, People pay lip service to that not being the case, but you can feel it when
Mm,
there's
mm,
a one way is really key. This totalism. Robert J. Lifton, this great writer on cult dynamics and brainwashing, from the 50s, who was studying like Chinese re-education camps and all these cults cropping up in the US later on. He talked about, wow, I lost my train of thought in the middle of my sentence.
the
Um,
totalism.
Totalism. He talked about totalism a lot. Everything in your world has to fit into this one mindset, this one ideology. And if there's parts that don't fit, you're asked to exile them, basically.
Mm, mm.
There's parts of your experience that are not cooperating with the psychological state that you are trying to achieve that has been predetermined as the right state. They are a problem, right?
Yeah.
Super strong frame to hold towards yourself.
Totally.
There are people in the world who are not living in accordance with this thing. They are the problem, or they are just lesser. They don't get it. There's
Hmm.
a label. There's a lot of labeling things. There's a lot of categorizing things, labeling things. In that sense, it's very much a finite game with preset boundaries,
Hmm.
preset roles. It's kind of like form, not formlessness. Not a lot of room for formlessness. Um, Not a lot of room for role flexibility, for
Right.
genuine uncertainty about the precepts of this whole thing. Well, what if
Mm.
I don't want to be enlightened? People are like, what? How could you not want to be
What?
enlightened? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I don't.
Yeah,
Maybe
no, I
I feel like
noticed that a lot. Enlightenment being put on a pedestal feels like a huge one, or enlightenment as the only good state to work towards felt like a huge one. Something that stuck out as well was, as you were talking, you were saying a lot of these like are very implicit, very subtle, a lot of these dynamics. And
Yeah.
I noticed that as well. A lot of times the lip service, the what people say is different from like the feeling that I was getting in interacting with certain people. And there's like, of course, do critical thinking. That's great. You know, like trust
Mhm.
your experience. And then the feeling that I would get in interacting and being in relationship with these people would be like, yeah, but the teacher's experience is more valuable. Like you gotta, but just trust the teacher's method, and you'll have the experience of awakening someday for yourself or something like that. You know,
Yeah.
but and it was just like, yeah, very subtle like feelings I was getting and relating with the different people and the teacher and all of this stuff. And that like, you know, it wasn't very explicit, and that's why it was so, I felt like easy to be captured in these dynamics. And like I had this like, I think you talked about this in the Twitter thread. One of the reactions was like this kind of fear and this like
Yeah.
irritation at everything, because I was like, oh shit, what is happening? Something's happening here. I don't know what it is, and I'm scared that I'm gonna fall into this reality tunnel and
Yeah.
not be able to get back out, and then I'm just like just stuck or something.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that speaks to some amount of discernment that a part of you already had. Like when I when I was joining the group I was in, I was 23. I had like 0 IFS parts being like, "This is bad." Everything
Mhm.
was like, "This is crazy. Let's go on this roller coaster ride." Like there was nothing keeping me from
Yeah.
falling in. I think most people past a certain point in their life, there will be a part of them
Mm,
saying like, I don't know about this." Like,
right.
something here feels off.
Mhm.
And yeah, I did write about that a little, that that can be it's a sign of like a red flag a little bit, but it's also just like a bit of a stopgap, like some kind of measure that can be there to slow things down a little and
Right.
give you a second, sort of like that moment between stimulus and response that like Viktor Frankl talks about, like where choice and freedom live.
Mm.
Just a second to be like, am I sure I want to do this? Should I go spend a week, with my best friend and come back? Like some of these spaces where you don't, I guess this is getting into a little bit of like, if you think you're falling into a reality distortion field, what's one thing you can do?
Mhm.
And I guess I would say one principle is it's often very hard to yank yourself all the way out. We're often caught before we know we're caught.
Mm, mm.
And that means they've already offered you something implicitly that you want in most cases. And even if a part of you is like, yikes, I'm yanking the other way, there's to varying degrees, depends on the person, depends on the situation. But
Mhm.
many cases you're more caught than you think you are. You're like, I'm not in love with this person, but you already are. It's like that. Like,
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
just playing the game in which you're like, no, it's casual. It's like, no, it's and so I think giving yourself consciously the option to be in a liminal space that is not one of total commitment or total rejection is a
Mm, mhm.
very, very powerful gift to give yourself in those moments that
Right.
just expands the space you have in which to integrate the different parts of yourself
Mm.
that may be disintegrated around how you should relate to this thing, where a part of you is like, this is the truth. I found the answer. And it's really pulling on your sense of relief or your at
Mm.
finding the truth or your sense of community or whatever it is. It could be anything.
Like wanting certainty, you know?
Yeah, that's the big one. Yeah, wanting
Yeah,
certainty.
feeling comfortable having everything figured out because in this one particular
Yeah,
way of viewing the world, it's a closed rational loop where everything is,
yeah.
taken into account, and it feels good, like to
Mhm.
to feel certain. Yeah.
It feels amazing. It's the best
Yeah.
feeling. You gotta own that. It's a great feeling. Like, you gotta admit that to yourself. Like, God, it
Yeah,
feels good. I don't
it,
really
it
want to give
is.
this up.
Oh my god, that's so good. And yeah, I noticed that in terms of just belief systems in general. I've found myself falling into a lot of different echo chambers and in different kind of slightly closed loop belief systems, because it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's hard to just sit with any of these could be true. I'm not sure how to judge and discern which one is true, which one I should put my attention into, which one I should use to make sense and put a filter over how I view the world.
Absolutely.
And I don't know when to switch those filters, so I'm just going to kind of lean towards this one filter and kind of use that most of the time.
Yeah. How do I make my decisions? Otherwise, how do I decide what's valuable? I mean,
Yeah.
giant. It's
It's
kind of
hard
like, go ahead.
it's hard to make decisions when you're going between realities constantly.
Mimetic realities or echo
Yeah.
chambers or and my parents believe this and these people believe this in this community and it's
Right.
hard to connect to people, and that's
Mm,
the bigger thing. I think that's the deeper fear that actually makes us want certainty about reality. It's actually about connection in a lot of cases, right? It's like,
mm,
how do I
mm.
connect to anyone if I don't know what's going on and I'm not sure that I trust what they think is going on?
Right.
If we're not on the same page, how do we love each other? Like, how do we bond? What do we talk about? It's like
Yeah.
what so many millennials and like maybe at some point Zoomers find with their like boomer parents. It's like we're living in different worlds. How do I connect to you? We're
Mm,
part of different mimetic tribes,
right.
and that's what's really painful, and what I think is often the underlying driver that makes certainty and clarity feel so good
Mm,
and be so necessary, at least temporarily. Um, And like there's nothing wrong with those things, obviously, but it's kind of like you need to have the grace to let it go when it's time, and like
Mhm.
time to shift back into not knowing.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think it's something that I heard a podcast that was talking about, like Carl Jung had this concept of the transcendent function, which is essentially the capacity to be drawn in two directions and just sit with it
Mm,
and
mm.
just exist and just keep being pulled in two directions.
Yeah, yeah.
And also that
Wow.
there's like sort of an magic solutions that arrive out of that space, but it's extremely uncomfortable.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
there's so much good stuff here. I have this sense that that skill is like one of the most important skills to develop. How I kind of
yeah,
let that land was a sort of learning to interact with people in different reality tunnels, in different reality distortions, what in different whatever you want to call it, learning to interact with people that are seeing the world in completely different ways, and not to be like, you know, you're wrong, my reality field is right,
yeah,
my meme is right. And yeah, it's so uncomfortable to do that. And we were speaking a little bit on like, I'm fascinated to speak on communities and critical thinking and epistemology and all this stuff, and how I currently understand it, or the position that I'm currently in at the moment, is I feel that being in relationship with people of varying belief systems is utterly necessary in order to,
yeah,
you know, have a good epistemology. Because,
yeah,
and I want to go back to what you said, insularity is not good epistemology.
yeah,
And that, and I think, yeah, because as I brought up the community thing, there was like, yeah, but there's like bad epistemology in communities too. And so what feels present, what feels in sensing into how to have a good epistemology, it feels like, yeah, the insularity thing is huge. If I'm trying to make sense of the world by myself, if I'm insulated from the world, then I'm probably going to be a little bit narcissistic, think I'm right, go really deep into my
mm,
kind of closed loop.
yeah,
If I'm in a community, but that community isn't connecting with the outside world at all, and they're kind of in their own closed loop, it almost feels like this sort of closed loop, not interacting, not getting my ideas shot down, or putting a critical eye on any of my ideas, whether in community or solo, feels like
yeah,
kind of the trap that I'm noticing. And that I'm like,
yeah,
how do you avoid that trap of just insulating yourself, or even a whole community from the rest of the
yeah.
world?
And when it's a whole community, it's almost like you've got this quality where you get the entire weight of a whole group of people doubling down on the perspective
Mm,
that one
yeah.
thing is right. And then all of a sudden, the more attached you are to those people, the more you love and care about them, the more that your personal goals are mixed up with those people, the
Mm,
stronger the weight of the reality that that has to stay in that one shape, or
mm,
else you lose all these other things. So you end up with an inflexibility about what you can believe if you want to stay connected, basically.
mm.
Um,
Like, in order to go against the epistemology would mean to create a whole entire new network of friends. And
yeah, which
yeah.
it did, like in my case. I mean, and often it
Mm,
does. It does. I mean, it puts part of why it's so devastating for people to be in these communities and then leave is that it puts essential human needs in conflict with each other, like two huge ones: the need to sense make and live in a reality that makes sense, and the need to be connected and feel love. And they're in
mm,
conflict. And you jam them together where to get one, you have to seriously mess up the other one.
uh,
You know, so you have to betray yourself. You get put in this position of
mm.
extremely difficult position. Um, oh man, I'm trying to remember what you had. I had so many thoughts while you were saying that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just
Here they
saying
come out.
insularity, even if there's a closed loop, you know, even I've noticed a lot of people, like, one person that I got really drawn into online, like this intellectual online. I at one point I stopped and I stepped back and I was like, I'm letting this person's reality distortion field completely
Yeah,
encompass the way that I view the world. And this person was like, basically, from what it sounds like, is this person
yeah,
was by themselves going very deep into very consciousness expanding tools, and then was like coming up with ideas about how the world works after that. So this person was like I think we would characterize them as a psychonaut, and they would just
Yeah.
like have these mind expanding experiences, but be in this closed loop of never interacting with anyone from the outside world. So then
Yeah, very
I at
common.
one point I was like, this person is like the most narcissistic person I've ever seen in my life, and they just think they unlock the key to the universe by themselves in their house,
Yeah,
now they're sharing
yeah.
it with the world.
There's something deeply uncollaborative and untrusting about the personalities of the people who tend to have reality distortion fields.
Right,
There's
right.
something so fundamentally lacking in trust that anyone else could help them have any of the answers, hold them
Mm,
emotionally, contribute to their thoughts. They tend to be extremely rigid. I mean, the high IQ ones, extremely protective of their mental material, of their thought process. Not that
right.
that's automatically sketchy, right? Like, I mean, it's also probably a feature of just like a lot of smart people. Um, and then what's tricky is that sometimes it's something like they're kind of schismed where like a part of their mind, maybe especially if they're like a psychonaut, they're brilliant along one dimension,
Mm,
is way ahead of you. They're genuinely smarter than you or more developed in on some dimension, and you can
mm.
sense that. I mean, I'm saying you as we're identifying
Right. Yeah, yeah.
losing themselves here a little. Um, but and so they're in this territory where you can't see it. It's like fuzzy, and you're like, oh, they're like ahead of me. They're like in this juicy. There's like secret knowledge there. There's like all these insights. There's all this good stuff. I'm really attracted to that. I can feel it because you're smart and you're brilliant, and you can
Mhm.
tell when there's something juicy.
Right.
But also, they're messed up and traumatized and human and whatever. And what you
Yeah.
can't see is the way that that is influencing their thoughts and
Mm,
and biasing their thoughts and what is biased and what's not and what's being affected by their weird stuff shadow
mhm.
and what's not. And it's probably both. There's some of both. And that's where people get affected in really complicated ways where they get a lot of value, but then the toxic stuff is like super powered because it's attached to this high development stuff.
Mm,
And
mm.
so you get the high development stuff when you spend a lot of time around them, but you also get this like really powerful, persuasive, psychologically persuasive, toxic stuff
Mm,
that like
mm.
takes up residence in your mind and everything keeps bouncing against that before coming back into your own experience. For example, like what you're kind of describing of they become a filter for your reality. That's one
Right.
dynamic that can occur. I don't know if that made sense.
Mhm. A bit. What I'm super interested in diving into the truth aspect of it. Like there's these these reality distortion fields. It's not like they're just completely false.
Yeah.
I think that's what you're pointing at. It's like there
Yeah.
can be some people that are extremely developed on one line of developments,
Mhm.
and in that one aspect of their psyche, they're actually much further ahead of the curve than most people. And it
Mhm.
feels like that's why people get drawn into them. Like, holy shit, there's some like valuable truth here, and this person
Yeah.
is extremely developed. And how do I become that developed? And then
Mhm.
there's all right, so then I'm just gonna follow them, and then and it's like, how do I get there's like a trouble there for me. There was a problem discerning, all right, what is this development that
Yeah.
feels much further ahead of the curve, and oh, I'm going to do that, but I actually didn't realize that there's a lot of lesser development in these other areas that I had no
Yeah.
clue about, and now that's actually like pulling me down in, I don't know, moral development, or other aspects. Emotional development is being reduced while this
Mhm.
consciousness expanding, whatever you call that thing, is being increased. So it's like it's so
Yeah.
complex, and like
Yeah.
how do you discern that, or if you could just riff on the partial truth aspect of it.
Oh, it is the knot of the whole thing. It is the
Mm.
difficult is that I said this to you before we started talking. Reality distortion fields by definition are always also like also good or also true, I think. Um, I mean, I guess they can be deceiving you into thinking that there's something really good and there could be nothing, but usually there's something really juicy there.
Mhm.
Um, and it's just about always. So some of us are like, how do I usually phrase this? For any given reality distortion field or person with one, there are people who are going to be immune. And then for every person, there's some reality distortion field or cult or guru who will totally hook them, right? Does that make sense?
I think so. What I'm hearing is people's psyches are different, and so the reality distortion field that captures them is going to be different for everyone.
Yeah, yeah, and everyone's susceptible to something, and nobody is like totalizingly dominating the space. Like
Right,
it's
right.
not like one that everybody's gonna fall for.
Mhm.
Um, and so where am I going with this? It's always contacting you in an area where you're underdeveloped or you are
Mm,
repressed is more often the case. It's like your shadow. Um, there's somewhere where you want something but you can't own you want it, or you believe something exists in the world but not consciously, like some really dark supervillain that like a part of you got it in your subconscious that this exists out there, and it's actually kind of important for the way your psyche functions that you believe that this is real, but you don't
mhm.
ever consciously think about it. If someone asked you, do you think there's supervillains who can know everything to perfect clarity, you'd be like, that's ridiculous. But unconsciously, you've got a slot open for that. And if
Mm,
somebody comes along and they know they're like a dark wizard, basically, and they know how to consciously or unconsciously, they know how to slip into your unconscious slot. All of a sudden, you're like, holy smokes, I always knew this existed and now it has manifested right in front of me. Like, and that could feel really good or it could feel really horrifying depending on what the slot is. It could feel any range of phenomenology,
mhm.
but it will feel powerful. It will have an effect on you. Um, and I don't know if this will make sense, but because it's a slot in your own unconscious most of the time, where you're not developed, where there's something there your conscious mind can't handle yet or integrate yet,
Mhm.
you often don't have, that's why you often don't have access to what exactly feels different, because you can't even see the part of you that is agreeing to live in this other reality because it's part of your unconscious. It's not your conscious mind that they're affecting in the more.
Can you say that again in a different way? That's why this feels different,
Yeah. Yeah.
or expand on that?
Yeah, like give me a second to sort of rephrase it.
Mm,
There's like an asymmetry in where they're developed and where you're developed, right?
mhm,
They're and they might be consciously developed, but I think there's also this unconscious dynamic where they're offering you something like total significance, complete sexual surrender, you know, the presence of a father figure who will always love you, um, something that is like a deep unconscious archetypal being or force,
mhm,
or they're offering something or they're threatening something sometimes is also the way that this reality distortion field works. They're saying, I have the power to turn your whole family against you. I am this figure who
mm,
can make all of the world ostracize you, or I can make you unimportant or something. There's like a message coming from their unconscious towards
mhm,
you.
mhm.
This might sound really out there. Um, and you're picking up on it and believing it, basically. You're, and it's like all shadow interaction.
Right.
And I guess I'm saying because it's shadow interaction, that's part of what gives reality distortion fields this quality of being hard to trace, hard to name,
Why it's
hard to
so
explain.
implicit and
Yeah, why
subtle.
it's implicit. Because if they just said that to you, you'd be like, wait a second, that doesn't make any damn sense.
Right, right.
That's not who you are. Like,
Yeah.
weird. I don't actually believe this. Like, um, yeah.
Right. The kind of mental picture that's coming up as you're explaining this is like the lines of development again, right? So if
Mhm.
someone is like actually very developed in this one line,
Yeah.
maybe I'm actually lacking development from baseline in this one line, and it's like, holy shit, I'm trying to develop myself socially, emotionally,
Mhm.
spiritually, etc., and it's like this person is developed in that line, they
Yeah.
can show me how to develop in that line. And it's
Mhm.
almost like the word that was coming up is this word I came across recently from Jamie Wheel, which was golden shadow. It's like there's this a lot of shadow, like we view shadow a lot as like the dark stuff that we don't want to look at, the stuff that's like pulling us back, right? But there's this idea of like a golden shadow, which is like, oh, there's actually some greatness that we want to step up into, but there's a shadow there around not being able to, and like being afraid of stepping into that. It almost feels like the same way if someone's very developed on like one line of development, there's like this golden shadow that like latches onto them, and it's like, oh, they can like help me break through this greatness block, and I can just develop so much in this line that I feel lacking and incomplete in at the moment.
Yeah, and it could be that you're accurately perceiving that you can get that, and it could be, to map it onto the thing I was saying before, that they're implicitly kind of offering you like, I'm the teacher who will make you who you were always meant to be, you know, like they're sort of giving you this offer in the background of every interaction that you have with them in some kind of subtle implicit way. And that could be true, or that could be a lie. Either way, right? Or they could be sort of not intending to make you any particular offer, but you do accurately assess that you could learn a lot from them, and then there's just like weird consequences to that sometimes.
Well, what I'm sensing is like in a lot of these, in my experience with a community like this, it may not be for everyone, but I had this sense of, if I would have stayed there, I would have developed on this one line of development. I think this is what we were talking about a bit. It's not that you actually like, perhaps someone is developed, and perhaps by being around them, they will actually help you develop. Like you will actually develop on that one line of development. The problem isn't that whether or not you'll develop. It feels like the problem is that you'll develop, and you'll also develop all of these reality distortion and these,
what baggage are you taking?
all the baggage in order to develop on that line.
Kind of, what is the contract you're signing with them, and is it a contract with the devil? And like, are they being like, I'll give you all this, not are they being like, it's not maybe that agentic, but like, what is the cost? Like, do you have to also pick up on all of their unhandled shadow because that's somehow kind of the source of their genius, and you're going to have to just absorb all of that as the apprentice? And then that might be worth it. That might be worth it for some people. It might be worth it, right? The problem is it's hard to know ahead of time because you often don't know what you're doing. Or what else am I going to experience from letting this person have a lot of influence over me in the way that I would let a mentor or a teacher have influence over me consciously? And I think it's important to remember that there are brilliant mentors and teachers who are very low cost, maybe not no cost, but like pretty low cost. They're still human beings. They got flaws. They're normal.
Low cost is in baggage you have to.
Low baggage for you. These people do exist. And I think fundamental to falling into people's reality distortion fields is always a sense of scarcity. This is the only person. No one else is this developed, you know, or no one else will help me in these ways, or no one else has this kind of wisdom or this kind of mental tech or whatever it might be. And it makes sense. There are things that are rare. They're usually not totally exclusive.
Especially in terms of like spiritual development, you see a teacher who claims to have done X amount of years of spiritual development, of isolation, of meditation, of etc. And it's like, oh, I'm not going to find someone that's gone this deep into the spiritual practice, you know? Well, there was something here. So I'm very curious to hear you expand a bit on what you said in your Twitter thread, which is like, if you are able to become more conscious and aware of these dynamics, you can actually use these forces for good. And you said something about like the Buddha in disguise, or like the Buddha of compassion in disguise, all these like seemingly devilish characters, you know, and cult leaders. Can you expand on that?
I think in the positive version, or, you know, a positive thing that's possible is that they lead you back to yourself. You know, this encounter, whether they meant to or not, or whoever this person is, you have an opportunity to integrate your own shadow because you're learning something about something that you want, that you maybe can't own that you want, or something that especially if it's like, for me, it's been like, oh, like total significance or total importance was something that
Mhm.
I think I really fell for. Like, I'm going to be important. I'm going to matter. Like, I'm an actor. I want to be famous. Like, I don't want to admit that I want to be famous, right? But like, I do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
All the stuff that you really don't want to admit. And it's actually uh, can be a gift and I do think a little bit of levity, a little bit of embarrassment is the right attitude to kind of like let yourself have with your shadow. Like, yeah, okay, geez, I want to be a spiritual genius who's above everyone else, but also loving and caring. And I want them to all think I'm special, but I want to be good at the same time. It's like, okay, like that's fine. That's not bad.
Yeah.
Um, and sometimes it sounds darker than that. Yeah.
I've noticed myself, now that you say that, I've noticed myself fall time and time again into this shadow of some sort of like absolute knowing, or
Hmm.
some sort of like, yeah, everything feels relative and I'm just always confused. And it's like, what if there's some sort of absolute knowing you can attain through a deep meditative state or through XYZ? And it's like, it's very attractive to me to have like somehow total certainty over, drop all concepts and you'll get to something that is totally certain and that can't be,
Hmm.
something like that, which is what a lot of wisdom traditions talk about. But in my attempt to like search for that, it's been co-opted for all these different things. And then I've fallen into all these reality distortion fields. Whether or not that's possible, I don't know. Maybe it is. But because that shadow feels present, then I end up falling into all these traps because of
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so basically, if you know that you want that, then you have more autonomy over how you seek it. And you
Mm,
know that you're going to fall for certain kinds of things. You're going to be attracted to certain kinds of things. And it's something just like I knew this like shaman guy who said something great that always stuck with me. Keep your fear out in front of you.
mm,
I think it's kind of the same. It's like, keep your crazy shadow stuff out in front of you. You don't have to get rid of it. Like, you don't have to change it. Just keep it out in front of you so you're the one deciding what's
mm,
going to influence it or how you're going to try to feed that.
right.
If you're going to try to feed that. And so it can be a gift. So you learn, like, okay, I'm really trying to develop myself in this way. That's a beautiful thing. Um, keep it yours, right? It's
Mm,
like, keep it yours. There's also like, I've come to think there's no shame in being manipulated by people. Um,
right.
that's a really important thing. I mean,
Mhm,
most people feel shame. I felt a lot of shame about it. Um, but you're supposed to be like good and trusting and like, if you believe in any of these spiritual traditions, like innocent in a certain kind of way and
mhm,
wanting the best. And like, yes, we need to like incorporate the awareness that there's like other kinds of things going on that can interact with that in ways that aren't not good for us.
right.
Um, but there's no shame in it. Or the shame can be temporary. It really is an opportunity to learn about yourself and
Mm.
what you want so badly that you'll flip your mind inside out to get it. Hopefully, you unflip it inside out and choose to pursue those things more on your own terms next time.
Yeah, I've noticed in my experience around trying to do shadow work and parts work,
Yeah.
it's the shame is like, I don't want to say the killer, but like what makes the process so much more difficult is thinking that I will not be okay until all my shadows are dealt with. And why do I have these
Oh
shadows?
my
These
God.
shadows are bad. It's
Bad
like,
shadows. I want different ones. I want to trade them out.
yeah, why
Good
do I have
shadows.
these shadows? If I could only just fix this one
Oh
shadow,
God.
then
Yeah.
then I'll be fine.
Then I'll be fine with my shadow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Uh,
Yeah. 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 It's a deep like they all say, it really comes down to self-acceptance. Not that I'm a whiz at this. I'm at the very
mhm,
front end of just realizing how stupidly I've dealt with all of my, all the judgments
yeah.
that are there. But having so it's also that um having the sort of like the self-love to see your shadow in all of its like horrible glory, like in all like you're
Mhm.
probably like sadistic and like everybody's different, but like not you specifically.
That
But like, you never know what you're gonna find down there in the underworld, right?
Mhm.
And the more we develop that self-love, which easier said than done, the more you can find out what, I don't want to say what you're really like, because you're also like all your conscious stuff and your good stuff, but
Mhm.
what some parts of you are like. And that humility and that love also will protect you from people pulling on those things and making them about their goals rather than
Mm,
yours. So in
yes.
a way, it's like you got to be like, my shadow's there either way. Do I want it to be co-opted for someone else's purposes, or do I want it to be serving me? Those are
Yeah.
the options you have. You don't have the option to get
Yeah.
rid of it. I sometimes think I do, but
Mhm.
you know.
No, that was great. That was great. I think we've covered this, but I don't think I've made the connections yet of like discernment, like especially like we kind of started on like the critical thinking discernment track, but for some reason to me it doesn't feel like it's finished all the way up. How do you understand, like, all right, you're in some sort of reality tunnel.
Mhm.
Critical thinking is not enough to realize that you're in a reality tunnel. I had a conversation of like a couple months ago with this philosopher who was talking about how rationality is like closed looped, right? So like rationality alone will not get you at any sort of absolute, or rationality alone won't do it, because rationality is just circular and it just goes in on itself. And we actually need some like higher order, some we talked about beauty a lot. Like if you have an experience of beauty, it's not rational, it's like something that you don't quite understand, but that's like influencing your perception. And so
Mhm.
if we kind of take as like a core idea that critical thinking is not enough, that we need rationality is good, but not rationality alone, only rationality. How do you understand like the discernment, the other kind of, I like to use the phrase like modes of knowing. How do you use like the other modes of knowing to like, what is that process phenomenologically, and just in general, how do you understand the discernment?
Yeah. Yeah. Discernment, such a good word. It's been such a theme for me over the last bunch of years. It's been like the project. Become more
Yeah.
discerning. Um, yeah. So I do think I kind of said this before. There's a sort of meme that, oh well, I won't fall into a guru thing because I have critical thinking skills and this and that.
Mhm.
And it's like, that's all fine and well. The group I was part of was built around developing critical thinking skills and top-down epistemology and
Mhm.
logic and the history of philosophy. That was its whole shtick. We
Mhm.
still went off the rails. I think that's kind of inarguable. Um, so it's not sufficient. Um, I think any group or environment or person who encourages you to take one of your faculties of perception offline, to
Mhm.
distrust it, I wouldn't do that. Now, I would say you need all of them. I wouldn't say any one is going to save you. I would say any one alone can be a loop, right? Because you also see people in the sort of deep spirituality groups that are like, don't think, don't, or don't worry, your emotions are fleeting or whatever. It's like all of that is information. We were built this way for a reason, even if we don't fully understand it. So I do think, like, I had to come back to my intuition was one thing I had to do after
Mhm.
leaving the group I was in. Um, just like the gut.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
did my gut say?
What was the felt experience of like coming back to intuition, coming back to the gut sense? I mean, I guess it's hard to describe, but like,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, it's still in process. It's a little bit like having impulses and acting on them before you can think about them. It's a little bit like being impulsive in a way, except that you're right. It's like muscle memory in a weird
Yeah.
way. It's a lot like self-trust. That's sort of the
Mm,
precursor to intuition, is that you have to trust that there's something in there worth trusting without thinking about.
right.
And so in that sense, it's sort of spiritual, because you're like, I don't know, there's something wise in there. It's not really me,
Yeah.
but I'm going to let it run the show. I think art making and these other kind of like flow states, like
Mm,
physical activities, sports, movement, making art, like
right.
socializing in a loud party, like do things that um, open space for intuition, or that I did that and that helped a lot, and it's still in process.
Mm,
And I think another thing is like what they call in the kind of like, again, not that all these things are cults, but in the cult research community, they call it just like psychoeducation, which is basically like become educated about manipulation, become educated about these dynamics,
mm,
know how they work, learn what the terms are, read about thought reform. If you don't know what that
right.
is, Google it. Like, um, that's one of the best protections too. And then um, you can talk to people about what it feels like, um, especially if you think you're bumping into something sketchy. Talk to other people who maybe are having the same experience and
Mm,
see if you can articulate what feels weird together. This can be tricky. People can get paranoid, etc. But like um, often you both are slightly blind and you're both slightly seeing, and you have blind spots where they don't, and they have blind spots
right.
where you don't. And so the
Right.
coming together, you can start to build a picture of
Mm.
what's going on there. But yeah, I'm still learning discernment. It's a lot of it seems to be, it's the last thing I'll probably say about it, like actually lately softening the hard lines between safe, not safe, good and bad, sort of softening the duality, honestly.
Mm.
Um, why is that good for discernment?
Like sitting in uncertainty.
Yeah, because it's hard to make sense of things when you have pre-existing hard categories like that, because
Mm,
things aren't like that. Um,
right.
and so discernment is about building like a nuanced, relatively accurate picture of what's going on.
Mm,
Um, so if you're only trying to answer, is this safe or not? It's actually can be an inhibition to discernment sometimes.
mm.
Um, if that makes sense, because it's a bit too binary.
Yeah, what I noticed in when I had to go through that process was it was way more complex and nuanced, and there's way more moving parts than I thought. But at one point, I got lost in that, and then I it was just like lost in my mind trying to understand the parts. And at one point, it's like, all right, this is very complex, very nuanced, and I don't fully understand all the parts. But my
Mm.
body's telling me to leave, so I'm gonna leave. Or like
Yeah,
I'm getting dissonance somewhere. I don't fully understand what it is, and if it's
yeah.
but there's dissonance, and I just
Mhm,
gonna leave, and I'll continue to process it, later.
mhm. Yeah, that you don't need to be able to articulate it to act on it. You don't need to be able to
Right, right,
justify
yeah,
it to act on it, right?
right.
Like, you can have a getaway response and just trust it, even if everyone else is like, "This is great. Why are you being so weird?" Like, um, you can always come back. I think making things less absolute. A lot of it is that we have psychological blocks to discernment, I guess, is the thing that I'm pointing out with this. It's
What do you
not
mean by
just
that?
models. Yeah, I guess I mean it's not just whether or not we know how to model what is a red flag or what's sketchy. It's also, are we willing to see it? Um,
Mm,
so a lot of times what I actually have been doing to model a situation where I'm unsure, now since leaving this group, I've got lots of paranoia. So I'm like, my paranoia is flaring up. Like, okay, let's look at this. Um, is I look at my incentives, like, what do I want to believe about this person or this situation? What am I tempted to think they're going to do for me? Um, and that could be either way. Like, it could be I want to believe that they're sketchy and bad because I don't want to risk being wrong, and actually the thing to
mm,
do is to try to trust someone again, and that I can model, like, well, what are the outcomes if I'm wrong? Well, in this case, it's not so bad.
mm,
Um, if I am wrong and I shouldn't have trusted them, I think I can deal with the outcome. So this is actually a case in which my discernment, having run through that process, tells me I should try trusting this person. The cost won't be too bad. I don't know if this is making much sense. I'm sort of articulating something live that I haven't tried to say before. So I guess I'm modeling not just what is happening in a situation, but what I want to have be happening, or what would make me most comfortable
mm.
to believe, and then just like including that in my assessment of what is going on. It's like a meta thing, I guess.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. I don't feel like I fully understood that, but the thing that stood out the most
Confusing.
was like sometimes you can leave a dynamic where it might have been better to actually trust them because you have whatever triggers or you've been in a really bad experience before. So in the future, it's like, oh, this person probably was good to trust or at least to give it a shot, but I didn't even allow myself to trust them because I've been so hurt in the past
Yeah.
from taking that act and it going way south.
That's the other reason why discernment's good that people don't talk about. They're like, oh, you got to be discerning so you don't get screwed over. It's like you also have to be discerning so you don't lose opportunities to love people and learn things.
Right. Yeah.
Um, like if you have bad
Mm.
discernment the other way, you're just closed down to everything.
Mhm.
So it's really about nuance.
Right. Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I felt like keep framing it back on this one experience I had, but there was
Mhm.
part of me which is like, am I just like, I had this one bad experience in the past. Is it more comfortable for me to just slap the label bad on this community and leave, or
Totally.
slap the
Yeah.
label cult? And a lot of it felt like, yes, it was easier to do that. And so a lot of me, so I guess the hard part was like, all right, it's more complex than that. This community isn't what I kind of came to is like, this community isn't all bad. It's
Yeah.
not just like this is a cult, this is bad, the leader has ulterior motives. It's like, no, this community has a lot of good aspects. I want to believe that it's bad, but it's more complex than that, and yet there's still dissonance or
Mhm.
something like that. um
Yeah. But believing it's bad is partly a strategy for getting yourself out of there.
right.
Like because a part of you probably wanted to stay. I mean, I won't speak for you, but in general, a part of us tends to want to stay because there's usually reasons to stay.
Hmm.
Um, or wants to doubt ourselves. I don't know, maybe I'm being sensitive. Maybe I'm the only one who's getting hurt. Maybe I'm being weird, whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and so the that's bad is a just as it probably always is. It's just a really clear message that gets us to take a certain action that maybe is the right action. Um, like I think I went through a similar thing and it was kind of oversimplified, but also got me to take the right action, which is to get as far away as I could possibly get, and incorporate a lot of new things into my psyche
Mm.
that I just couldn't have incorporated safely if I stayed too close to those people or that environment at that
Right.
time.
Right. Yeah, I also had this experience that after leaving, it also felt easier to say it's bad. Like, oh, why did I leave? Oh, because it was bad. It's like,
Hmm.
actually, no, it's more complex than that. I had dissonance, but it doesn't mean the place is bad. It just means I acted on the
Yeah.
dissonance, right? I noticed myself like
Yeah.
wanting, like being pulled towards this idea that, oh, this community is bad. This community is a cult. This community has a leader that is psychologically negatively affecting a lot of the community. And it's like, kind
Yeah.
of, but it's again, I think I really like what you said with the binary duality thing. It's like, it's never that simple, yet knowing that it's
Yeah.
also not that simple, you still got to take action. You still got to choose one way or the other, knowing that it's not simple.
Yeah.
So it's like holding those at the same
And there could
time.
be like one seed of something that's really bad and you need to process that seed and you paint the whole thing as bad, but that's because you're just trying to be like, no, you're trying to affirm like, no, I know something about that was seriously messed up.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't the whole thing, but I am not clear enough yet to say what it was, but something was super bad. And
Mm,
um and I think it's complicated by the sense making, the social narrative making process around these groups is obviously really fraught. People have very strong opinions in different directions. It's very important to people their own interpretations of what happened. So, like for example, it's high stakes. It might be high stakes for people who are there, what you say about it. It might be high stakes for other people who
mm,
left, who say it's terrible. If you say, well, it's kind of in between.
yeah.
So people are all very invested in the sense making process. And part of
Mhm.
what's so kind of difficult about these kinds of groups is that sense making is very hard because when people get hurt maybe in extreme but narrow ways and also helped maybe in extreme but narrow ways, uh, the mental reactions that are necessary for each individual to actually swallow whatever was extreme about their experience are often opposite. They're
Mm.
polar, they're very different. And that's part of what makes sense making difficult, if that makes sense.
you say that last sentence again? Sorry.
So that was
I got it up until that point. It was like
yeah.
the polarity thing.
Yeah, people's reactions are polarized to these communities because of the fact that they are often both extremely bad and extremely good. And that makes sense making difficult.
Extremely bad and extremely good, as in.
As in, sometimes being in a reality distortion field or being in a cult or guru community, it's both very, very, very good and powerful and beautiful, and very, very, very bad and toxic and
So it
manipulative
like
at the
increases
same
the
time.
intensity of the
Yeah, it's
sense
high
making
intensity.
in either
Yeah,
direction.
yeah, and
Yeah,
then the
yeah.
stakes of sense making are also higher because the stakes of sense making are always higher when something was extremely good or extremely bad,
Right.
right? If you've been in love with someone, completely outside of this context, sense making around that is really important to you because it was like a peak experience, you
Right,
know?
right.
Um, uh, or if you've been through some horrible trauma of some kind that's more straightforwardly
Mm,
bad, say, um, like I don't know, sexual assault or something like that, that might be more straightforwardly bad. I don't know. Um, it's yeah, the sense making is a bit easier, I think, and different people are carrying different pieces of a puzzle when they leave
mm.
a group like this
Yeah,
about the extremeness and extreme badness.
I definitely felt the investment stakes
Yeah,
of like being in the community. That's very strong. Like, or if you're gonna invest your entire life in this community, the sense that if someone pokes at a hole in the community, it's gonna really hurt or something like that.
yeah,
Um,
they devastate someone's whole.
yeah,
And you see that in what happens for people who leave a group like that and fully digest the experience. Like in not all cases, but in a lot of cases, it turns their whole world upside down and transforms them as a human being. And it's kind of, well, those are the stakes. That's why the stakes are so high
mm,
of not believing this.
yeah,
Because if you
yeah.
stop, you might have to go on quite a journey.
Yeah, you're gonna have to reconcile a lot of stuff after that.
That's going to be a wreck.
Um, there's two directions. I'm curious what sounds most interesting to you. I have this there's something around a lot of these communities have very powerful psychotechnologies at the core of them, right? And the
Yeah.
reason it feels like this is the good and bad thing, the reason it's so good or bad is because they're actually very effective at using a certain psychotechnology to induce a very intense state of consciousness. But then, and that's very good a lot of the times. It's very consciousness expanding. It's very like, I felt more love. I felt more bliss. I felt more healing connection than I've ever felt in my life in this small period of time. And like that experience itself isn't bad, but then it gets co-opted for whatever, name the psychological dynamic. It's co-opted for something.
Yeah.
Um, actually, I don't remember the other direction now, but like, what are your thoughts?
What are my thoughts? I mean, yeah, yes, I do think that's a really important part. And to be honest, I think it's, I mean, it's so complex when you add in high powered introspective or psychotechnological tools.
Mhm.
You're certainly, at the very least, opening people up more than they would be on average. For better, for worse, people are more open. I think you have to agree when they're doing this kind of work. They're destabilized more,
Mhm.
and that doesn't have to have a bad connotation. I think it's just part of what healing work is like. It's part of what messing with your mind does. It
Mhm.
destabilizes you. It opens you. Um,
Yeah, this is
yeah,
really good. I guess the question, more clarity on the actual question was knowing that that can happen and knowing that people uh in the one kind of resource that I went to during this experience to understand cults, it was like Jamie Wheel has this talk on how to build an ethical culture, what is a cult, all this stuff. And one of the things is that one sign that it's a cult is that if you have a powerful experience and then while the person is still destabilized, then they ask, do you want to join the community, or like find ways to kind of co-opt them into the reality distortion field, not when they first enter, but when they're in the most vulnerable place
yeah,
right after a peak experience. And so I think the question
right.
that's most fascinating to me is just sitting with what is necessary in order to hold that power with enough goodness and enough love such that because it's like psychotechnologies and peak experiences aren't going to go away. You know, these are things that we're going to be drawn towards over and over again. What is required in order to, after that happens, to hold that with enough goodness and enough ethics such that it doesn't get co-opted for, you know, a reality distortion field? I mean, huge question, but just like,
Yeah, that's a
again,
great
something
one.
I'm sitting with.
Yeah, it's a great question. Interestingly, the word that comes to my mind is pacing. Um, Pacing. And I think the reason is because my mind just did a quick calculation and I was like, I don't think, I don't think if there's too much of a power asymmetry between like the practitioner and the receiver of one of these psychological practices,
Mhm.
I think it just gets too hard to protect. I don't think you can rely on the virtue of the practitioner to the more extreme the power dynamic gets, the less I would feel comfortable saying you should rely on the goodness of the practitioner.
Mhm.
Um, because there's almost like a 1-to-1 ratio where like if they've got like a little bit of sketchiness, that's okay if it's a slight power differential. But if they've got a little bit of sketchiness and it's a huge power differential, that's going to affect that other person way
Right.
more,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so there's some sort of phenomenon like that where they build together.
Mhm.
Um, Sort of thinking this through live, and
If I could add one thing on
yeah,
that.
please.
So what I'm hearing is like, if you're using powerful psychotechnologies, do it with someone that you don't see as more powerful, like a trained facilitator, but it's like you see the humanness in them a lot. And it's not like this
Yeah,
person has mastered this and is a master of this consciousness tool or whatever.
yeah, it
And
might be
it's
work with
like,
the middle manager, so to speak.
right,
Don't
right.
work with the guy above him. Um, I think it's tempting to work with the boss guy, but the truth is, it's a little bit like a baby working with like a Keegan 5. Just like it's, or maybe that's too extreme almost, but like
Yeah.
it's like you can't see what they can see, and so you can't assess things. You can't assess where, oh, you know, this is really valuable, but in this one narrow area, they're a little weird. I think I'm going to blow off a little bit of what they say there. You
Mhm.
know, I think that's
You
a really
can't
important
sense that at
thing.
all.
You can't sense that at all because they're so far ahead of you. You can't make any of those judgments. So it can get to the point where everything they say is God, is the word of
Mhm.
God.
Right.
And if any part of their shadow finds that very juicy, they're going to be colluding with you on that.
Mm,
Yeah, I am
mm.
kind of like God. It feels really good. How great you think I am, you know?
Yeah.
And you're not a monster for enjoying that, but we have to just kind of think practically about effects. And if they're dealing with someone who's only a little bit less developed, maybe they get a little bit of that pleasure of you, a little bit think they're great, but I think you're balancing out those effects quite a bit.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Yeah, and then I think the reason I said pacing is that oftentimes the promise is one of speed, or effectiveness. It's like, I'm going to get you to enlightened faster than anyone else, you know?
Mm, yeah.
I'm going to get you somewhere quickly that you want to go. Not always.
And so like, if you were working with someone that didn't have as much power, it'd be like, I'm going to get you somewhere, but we're not.
I'm going to get you the next step
I'm going
together.
to get you to the next step. I'm not going to get
Yeah.
you all the way to the goal. Whereas if there's a guru, it's like, I'll get you to enlightenment.
Yeah.
Just stick with
Sometimes they're
me along
selling
the
you,
whole. Yeah.
they're advertising, they're selling you something that probably they're not going to get you. You
Hmm.
might grow a lot from being around them. Um, but because of the nature, it's like basically like, don't be fooled into forgetting the nature of growth, right? Like it goes at a certain pace, it works a certain way.
Yeah.
Nobody can promise you that it works differently than that because that's just how it works. Like it can go fast. You can learn quickly. Children
Yeah.
learn
Yeah.
really fast.
Hmm.
Certain environments are extremely conducive, but there's a limit. There's just is an upper limit. If someone's
Right.
promising you something faster than that limit, they're lying or they're deluded,
Mm,
right? Or you're miscommunicating with each other or something.
right. Right.
Um, so there's something about pacing.
Mm, mm. Yeah, especially with a developmental theory stuff. I've
Mhm.
seen a lot of stuff in like integral communities and stuff like this where it's like I think you said you haven't delved too much into this, but basically like Keegan five, there's like a lot of people in the whatever the same thing in that is for integral or spiral dynamics. It's like we'll get you to second tier, we'll get you to Keegan five,
Mhm.
or like it's so weird because in a lot of these developmental communities, there's like we're all Keegan five, we're all second tier. We need to help the rest of the population get up to us, and it becomes this like this like almost like group narcissism of like we're in this higher
Mhm.
stage, like come join us.
Mhm.
It's just this like egoic mental circular
Yeah.
thing. It's crazy.
Like, boy, I bet it feels great to be
Yeah.
one of the only Vegan fives. Are you enjoying that, Benny?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it feels
Oh my
good to
god.
know more than everyone else on the planet. Um, yeah, and
Yeah.
I think part of the part of the response to this, I've got a friend who is so wonderfully humble about these things. She's like, I think I got stuck at a Keegan 2 with a part of me, and I really have to like she's like so self-aware of it. She's like, yeah, I think I'm actually working on a 2 to 3 transition with like a bunch of my emotional stuff. And I
Mm,
so admire that. And I think one of the things we can do culturally to sort of protect against these kinds of issues is honor and value good self discernment
mm,
and not that I have any judgment. I don't know where she's at, and I don't need to know. But I don't think worse of her for whatever her self assessment is. I actually think better of her. And if she said she was going on a 4 to 5 transition, I'm not sure I'd think better of her for that
mm.
either, you know? So there's something about really this larger question of why are we trying to get so far ahead? And if you think you're so far ahead, why are you so upset that nobody else is? Why
Yeah.
don't you let them go on their own developmental journey? They're
Mm,
wonderful along the way. They're beautiful along the way. If you're so evolved, why don't you just accept them how they are a little bit? Is the thought I have. Like,
yeah.
and I
Mm.
get it, suffering, etc. Um, but
But in my own experience, so I found myself falling in that trap a lot. And like I'm
yeah,
still trying to reconcile like that whole trap that I was deep in exactly what you're describing, thinking I was at second tier and because I
yeah,
understood integral that other, it's such a
totally.
weird trap.
Yeah, it's so juicy,
It's so juicy. And it's like
so good.
I think it gets exacerbated and it makes made really worse by existential risk talk. Because
Mm,
I've noticed like part of me was like, or part of the circles I was in were saying that, all right, this way of understanding the world, it's like I'm talking about in terms of like integral, second tier, Keegan five, but I noticed like the same thing kind of happening in this kind of game B, meta game, meta modernism community where it's like the only way that the human race will survive is if we get enough people to the game B, to the what was it, transagoic, transrational, meta, whatever the word is, right?
yeah,
It's like if we get enough people to this, then they won't be playing game A competition, and then the world, like then humanity won't go extinct. And that's if to me it feels like that's a very kind of the existential risk part almost makes that trap really hard to get out of, is what I
yeah.
noticed.
That's interesting because it raises the stakes. We're
Right.
living in a background age of extreme anxiety about the end of the human race.
Mm-hmm.
Anxiety is a great opening for desiring certainty, of course, right?
Right.
Like we're just born, like our generation has just been born into we're multiple generations into an existential threat just being a part of life.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's that's crazy. That's a crazy amount of background anxiety to be born into that I didn't even process until I imagined what would it be like to live in a world without nuclear weapons. And I like felt my nervous system calm down a little. And
No
I was
way.
like, whoa, I know somewhere deep in my body, I haven't even thought about this stuff that much.
What?
I know somewhere deep in my body that there's a threat of annihilation at all times. Like it doesn't surprise
Mm.
me at all, given that we're more attracted to certainty or to these kinds of solutions for all of humanity. There is a genuine problem. We are trying to solve it, and also it's been unsolved now since I don't know since nuclear weapons came around or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and and that's anxiety inducing. And so a lot of it is there's nothing it's perfectly valid, and also kind of, the same thing of keep it out in front of you. Okay, I'm anxious about this. I do want us to find a solution to this. We all want us to find a solution to this. What strategy am I going to use? And can I bear not knowing if we're going to find a solution to all of us dying? I mean, this is like,
Yeah,
can you imagine
yeah.
a bigger developmental ask? I don't know. I don't know if I can do that. But can I bear that uncertainty? Which most human beings in all of history have not been asked to bear in the same way,
Yeah.
I think, to my knowledge.
It feels very central, the uncertainty aspect.
Yeah.
So I've noticed, I heard something really great from Jordan Hall, and he talks a lot about game B, existential risk, all this stuff. He said something that stood out to me, which was like, the best way to relate to the crisis is to realize that you did everything that you can, and if humanity goes extinct, that's okay. That's okay. Like to be in that anxiety, like I can't let that possibility happen, and like it's like this like restriction and this tightness, and like it is not okay if humanity goes extinct. And then it's like basically what he was saying is, if you're in that place, that's actually a bad place, or not the most effective way to actually enact something in against the extinction thing. And to me, it was very central. Like, same with a developmental thing. It is not okay if everyone doesn't develop to this high level of adult development, because if we don't get enough people to this certain level of development, then the human race will go extinct. And it's like, to me, it feels like that actually perpetuates more of this categorization, demonization, the word I like a lot is dehumanization. It's like, we're going to dehumanize all these people at lower stages. Exactly. It feels counterintuitive almost.
It's this closing down, closing more and more. You're closing in. There's only one goal, and anything that happens that's not on the route to that goal adds anxiety to the whole system. And it's so understandable. And what was the thought I had while you're saying that? Oh, I lost it.
I think what I was getting at is what feels most important to me is the humanizing any stage, being okay with any stage.
And that there's this paradox that you kind of see again and again in every part of life, I think, as you grow older and wiser, which is the only chance I have at achieving the goal is to let go of the goal. It's this like paradox, you know? The only chance I have at happiness is to stop being stressed out when I'm not happy and just let it be. You know, I find myself happier. You know? Right? The only chance I have at developing myself, my consciousness, is to not worry too much if I don't get there in my lifetime. It's the only chance I have, because there's something about that mental shift that opens us and softens us and makes us, I don't know what it does. I mean, learn, makes us receptive.
It's so paradoxical. Wow, it's so hard. It's so hard to
brain breaking.
Yeah,
it's so weird.
Just sitting with that right now, I'm like, I don't know how to respond given that paradox. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to relate to anything now.
It's and I do think these principles of I think finding other principles to anchor on for relating to other people's consciousness, for this is, James Carr says, ironically, the thing that causes evil is the attempt to extinguish evil in the other, which is just true and beautiful and broke my whole world when I read that. I think about it all the time. It's the attempt to control, prevent any evil outcome and destroy that in anyone else. And there's an extension to that in, you can't be unconscious. If you're unconscious, you're going to do bad things. Let me drag you into consciousness, or whatever it might be. So it's all a wild challenge. We're all going to fail along the way and trying to evolve in this way again and again. But
oh my god, that is so good. I had to write that down real quick. That was so good. thing that creates evil is the attempt to extinguish it. Wow.
Yeah.
In yeah, this is I find it fascinating talking about the developmental stuff. I was kind of obsessed with developmental psychology for quite some time, spiral dynamics, integral theory, ego development theory. I did never got a chance to get around to Keegan, but that I've
Yeah.
heard a lot of people talk about Keegan as well. And yeah, a couple of months ago, I interviewed this woman, Suzanne Cook-Greuter, who like helped popularize ego development theory and like really
Yeah.
did some scientific research on that. And it was so fascinating how she related with the developmental model that she spent most of her life, developing.
Yeah.
And basically it was the thing later. She's like, do not use higher or lower. I was like, the higher stages. She's like, no, it's not higher, it's later.
Yeah.
There's a difference. There's a
Yeah.
difference later, earlier, later versus higher, lower. It's like thinking it's not better or worse, it's just earlier or later. So she kept correcting me on that as I was talking, which I found fascinating. And she said something which was like, one, yeah, later stages are not better. That was a very key point. Another very key point was that kind of what I got from the entire talk with her was virtues and values are more important than whatever stage you're at. So she's like, someone could be at this low,
Wow.
like stage blue, like this very, you would say Keegan 2 or 3 or something like that. Someone could be at that, but they could be a virtuous human being, humble, wanting to do good. She's like, I would prefer someone at a lower stage that had a lot of virtue than someone at a higher stage that was narcissistic and intellectual and thought they knew everything about everything. And maybe they actually did have some development into that stage, into the later stage. But she's like, I would much prefer someone who just has core virtues and values as a human being at
Beautiful.
any stage. And I was like, wow, that's so amazing.
Wow. Just inverts the whole. And it's so true. It's so true. And people are honestly, people are so obsessed with the value that these like later development people can offer. And I don't mean to like poo-poo that. A lot of that development is essential to uh essential to society's, the turn of progress, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um maybe we need that for leaders and stuff, but so often you do see these like kind of high IQ developed people who are really lacking virtue and really lacking values that I want. And so I'm kind of like, okay, you've got a lot of power by virtue of being very developed in a certain way. You've gotten a lot of legitimacy from that. And maybe that's okay in a narrow sense, but in a broad sense, I don't really want you running the show, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think noticing what sorts of people we're attracted to in our own lives, and what that tells us about our own values, um, too, is kind of an interesting angle.
Mm.
Yeah, I love that she said that. That's so. I heard that and it felt like a balm. It felt like such. I was
Mm.
like, oh God, that's what I wish everyone was saying. That feels so nice to hear.
Wow. Wow, I'm glad. Oh
Yeah.
my God. Yeah. I'm curious to hear. I still have a little bit. I don't feel like I fully understand what you just said around. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but I'm curious to hear you expound on exactly how you've related to this in your life, but using who you relate with to be a reflector of your values, or right, like
Yeah.
using noticing what's happening in your life and kind of turning that into signal, like, all right, I'm hanging out with these types of people that means something about my values, what I see as important. I feel dissonance or hatred or irritation towards this trigger, whether it's a person or an ideology or anything in the environment. What does that say about me? Like, this is a process I've been fascinated about. Like, what does it look like to do that? How do I actually take signal from the environment and be like, oh, this is reflecting something within me.
Mm. I don't know. I kind of said that as an offhand thought that occurred to me.
Yeah.
Honestly, I was a little bit like, I should think about that.
Yeah.
But I will say that I noticed myself do a value flip-flop after I kind of left the organization I was in. It was an odd place for me to go to in the first place. I was like sort of a black swan. I was very different. It was this very critical thinking, intellectual, rational place. And I was coming from acting school in New York, and the bohemians and the artists and the
Mm.
actors and the performers and the kind of love of beauty and
Hmm.
appreciation of sensitivity and vulnerability. And um, such a different world. And I think I'm really still trying to integrate these really different, really powerful influences in my life and doing so very clumsily. um, but yeah, I did do a flip flop where I found myself very soon after leaving this kind of urban, intellectual, sort of like sixth chakra kind of environment.
Mm.
Like somehow a couple months later woke up on a farm in Colorado surrounded by sort of like spiritual, like crossing over into woo, like older people, nature
Yeah.
people, gardeners, like Zen practitioners, shamans, all this stuff that was like
Mm.
really, really different. And like clearly trying to seek some sort of balance there.
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
some kind of value yo-yo.
Mm.
um, I don't know. So I don't know if that contributes anything. I think it's a good
Oh, that's
question.
great. Yeah, it's
But
something to sit with for sure. I
yeah,
I think I'm super interested to dive in. This is what came up as you're speaking, like with parts work, especially when I do IFS and parts work, it feel if it's a very interesting process. I get a lot out of the process of IFS, um, but to me, it feels like I could be supercharged. The process of doing IFS or working with different parts of the psyche, to me, feels like it could be supercharged by, developing some sort of ability to notice triggers when I get triggered. What like notice environmental triggers. I think maybe that's a little bit of a shift from values.
mm,
But I really have this. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on IFS. You said you do a bit of IFS and
yeah.
work with various people in IFS. Like, what's present for you around that, using understanding what to work on. Oh, this part is present. Do I work on this, or there's a trigger? Can I like get at why I was triggered, or just like, yeah, does that bring anything up?
Can you clarify the question slightly?
Yeah. So I guess, well, first, I was just interested to hear the question that I asked before about values and virtues and how do
Yeah.
you notice the environmental stuff. Maybe it would be you would have more thoughts if I kind of switched rather than values and virtues,
Hmm.
switching that in terms of noticing something from the environment, using external triggers to more effectively do IFS.
Oh, yeah. So sort of like how do like triggers, noticing triggers from your environment, kind of how can those lead into IFS work? Is that some of
Yeah,
the
yeah, definitely.
yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I do IFS and a bunch of other kinds of techniques with people I work with. Yeah, I think it's a perfect place to start, honestly. Uh, there's usually a sort of like a sensation set or a set of thoughts or whatever associated with a given uh, triggered experience. You're like, and then I found myself, thinking this a bunch of times and hating myself and
Mm,
doing blah blah blah, and I didn't want to talk to anyone all day or something, you know. So you're like, okay, interesting, and then you can kind of start with that and find what that part is that reacted to
mm.
whatever happened. And I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, but essentially, um, yeah, I think mapping triggers is actually really essential in a way to IFS work because it tells you a lot about what parts want and what concepts are real to them and what they're tracking in the environment,
Mm,
right? Because all these parts are always, it's like kind of like, oh, one of them took over. It's like, why? It's like it saw something in the environment that it thought it understood, and
mm,
that it thought it was the guy whose job it was to deal with, and so it came to the forefront. So they're always like, they are all tracking different parts of reality as relevant, I think. So what brings them up can tell you a lot about what they value, what models they have, what concepts they have, what schemas. I
mm.
don't know if that answers your question at all.
Definitely, definitely. I think, yeah, if it felt relevant. I also have this sense that, just taking like an overview. I just had this thought of like, what if I just took like 2 weeks, or like for like a certain period of time. I was like, I'm going to set the intention to every time I get triggered to like note that thing, and then to
Mm-hmm.
kind of get a sort of broad map of here's all the different times I've been triggered in the past month, in the past however many. whatever the time period is. And then like I have a feeling that that would be a really valuable way to really understand yourself on a deep level, because that's every time you get triggered, it's like pointing towards something. And then it's like, all right, I get triggered at all these things. And then like, what does it look like to then work with that as a part, work with that trigger, go back to it, say it's not present anymore. You get triggered, it's not present later. Then what does it look like? You just like mentally put yourself in that position again, try to reactivate that trigger or something like that. Or I don't know, just
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
thinking on the flow.
definitely. Yeah, sometimes trying to sort of, if it was like a flashback PTSD trigger, I may not guide someone towards like trying to reactivate it in the moment, or like keep enough distance, you know. But if
Right.
it's kind of like your average everyday household trigger, then I
Mhm.
think, yeah, kind of remembering the thing that happened. And also a lot of times if a client is sort of describing to me what happened, like a series of events, they often will name as relevant the thing that happened. And then they're like, and then all of a sudden I was feeling this thing and I don't know why. And it's
Mm.
like, well, you did say that the day before your boss said XYZ to you. Do you think that had something to do with it? So sometimes an outside person can
Mm.
see the pattern more clearly than you can if you just
Yeah.
sort of tell the story of the thing. Um,
Yeah, I get this sense. I'm curious
yeah.
what your sense of this is. I get this sense that when I do IFS, in IFS they talk about like protector parts and then
Yeah.
like core wounds and stuff like that. I get the part that I'm always working with some sort of protector. And it
Mhm.
almost feels like it's like this very long process, you know, of like I'm not going to go to the core wound on the first day of ever trying to do IFS, right? So it almost feels like to me sometimes it gets frustrating. It's like, why do I
Yeah.
just keep working with these surface level protector parts? Like, why can't I like get some real meaningful shifts in understanding my core wounds in a different way, having more acceptance of my core wounds, and almost, I guess this is a slightly different
Mhm.
direction from the triggers, but it
Mhm.
feels like somehow that relates. And like, you know, do you see IFS as like this multi-year long process of slowly picking away at eventually being comfortable with getting to the core wounds and accessing them and speaking with them and dialoguing with them?
You know, maybe I think it varies person to person. And I should probably state that I'm not like officially IFS trained. I just learned a ton of it during a
Right.
period of my life. Feel that I understand it. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
whether or not that's fine, I don't know. But I will say that a common um, misconception, maybe one of the most common misconceptions, is that the protector parts, the parts preventing introspection, that's the shallow stuff. I
Mm,
have often found that like I don't want to listen to one of my protector parts. I'm like, why can't I? And I'm like, well, you're not being very gentle towards your protector part. And it's like, okay, what would happen if I was actually compassionate towards it? And I feel this like jolt of like, oh my God, like that part has so much pain. There's so much going on there. And I think this wound is somewhere else, but actually this protector is holding something really deep and really important. And also often approaching those, sometimes it's not like deep emotional pain, but it's like key insights, the insight you need to have to build a good relationship with that protector and help it understand the rest of you is like a consciousness level insight. Like you need to realize that you are a system of parts and you've never actually realized that or something. Like, and this is a really weird identity thing to process. And
mm.
before you can explain, maybe you need to explain that to this protector so you can be like, no, 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 you got to get along with this guy because, you know, you guys are actually part of the whole, but you don't even know that. Like, you know, like you haven't even
Yeah.
taken in the implications of IFS or something like that, that
Mm.
might be necessary to helping this part understand why it needs to get along with another one or something like that. Um, so I don't know about multi-year process. I think it depends on the person, it depends on the shape of their mind, and it depends on the quality of the practitioner to some extent,
Mhm.
what's going on in the person's life. You know, if their background in a bad situation and trying to do this work, yeah, you're going to keep bumping into the protector because they still need it, right? There's stuff
Right.
like that too. Um, but I do think that that stuff that we often think is shallow, it's kind of like the obstacle's the way sort of thing, that annoying sort of idea that exactly what's getting in your way is exactly the thing that you need to have getting in your way.
Yeah, yeah.
You're so sure that you're trying to get to the thing right behind that. Uh,
Mhm.
so it's maybe a little unhelpful in a way. It's like, yeah, philosophy, but
In literally anything. In
yeah.
spiritual communities, the mind is evil. No, like work with the mind. What is the mind? What is the mind doing?
Yeah. Why are you so sure
Uh,
it's evil? What's it doing here if it's so evil?
right, right. Mm. Yeah, I've got this. I kind of like am doing like self-practicing on IFS, but I really enjoyed the insight that you had of like understanding the nature of IFS, or like maybe your parts actually don't really realize what's going on, or the fact that they actually are in some sort of ecology or something like that.
Mhm.
And yeah, there was this insight I had recently, which was like something released. Like there was a lot of tension between two parts. I was actually doing this in like a group setting, or like with a facilitator, and there was something that like really released, and it was super beautiful. I was like, oh shit, I'm hating this part, but this part is actually me. Like the
Yeah,
both of these parts are me. By
yeah.
hating this part, it's hating myself, and by the part hating me, it's just like causing this unnecessary tension where, and it's
Mhm.
like, oh dang, both of
Mhm.
these are both
Totally.
selves, and then something just released, and I was like,
Yeah,
this crazy, not crazy experience, but it was like, it was so beautiful. It's like, oh my God, I didn't realize this before.
yeah, yeah. And it's sometimes, yeah, totally. I think that is like kind of the key thing that people have their minds blown by with IFS all the time, that I did, that everyone, it's always, it's like, wait, the part that is judging this part is also me. And then
Yeah.
it's like, what? Like, and like a good practitioner, it's like often they lead you to the first time to notice, to make the subject object, where you realize that the intention with which you're coming at something is also a part, right? And that's one of the
Mm,
biggest contributions I think IFS has to make to the psychology space, is like
yeah.
become aware of the intention with which you are introspecting, become aware
Mm,
of the intention with which you are trying to grow and doing. Why are you in therapy? What is that intention coming from? You
mm,
know, like, good to know. Doesn't have to be any particular thing.
yeah.
Um, but awareness about that background intention is, and that's sometimes a consciousness shift, honestly, because it is, I mean, in the Keegan concept, you move up stages as you make the subject object. So the thing you're acting from and identified with becomes something you look at,
Right,
and
right.
interact with. And so I think there's a meta sense in which sometimes I think it can be the case that our quote unquote bottleneck on some sort of growth that we're trying to achieve, working with a protector or whatever, um, it's because, like, as we're working on that, we're like learning all these other things in a million different areas of our life that actually amount to a consciousness shift that is
Mm,
actually the thing that is eventually going to unlock this. And we aren't there yet.
right, right.
But we're getting there, but not through this one narrow process. We're getting there actually through the living of our life.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I don't know.
I noticed I think you said that you used this phrase in one of your tweets as well, but there's this phrase I've kind of latched onto, like transcend and include,
Mhm.
which feels like the subject object shift
Yeah,
as
that's
well.
the integral theory thing,
Yeah,
right?
it's like the
I did
integral.
that from
It's
Wilber. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I just made that connection when you said like no, part of parts work is noticing the part that is
Mm-hmm.
working with parts, or noticing the witness that is trying to understand the parts. And I just had this feeling of like that is the transcend and include process, like down,
Mm-hmm.
like described like to a T, right? It's like, oh, what part is actually working with these parts? What
Mm-hmm.
for some reason I can't think of
Yeah.
any other way to say that, but
Yeah. No, exactly. And that's sometimes why it's like these parts that we're identified with that are like running the show. It can take a long time, because actually coming to be meta on those parts means entering a mind space we've never been in before.
mm,
Maybe very uncomfortable. That's new.
yeah.
That's maybe more formalist. That's foreign. Like it's and so there's a little bit of a question of like, how do I live as the person I am in the meantime, while
Hmm.
I'm, which I don't know the answer to, but
What keeps coming up is when in Suzanne Greuter's model of ego development theory, part of the some of the later stages are
Mhm.
characterized by not having as rigid of a self, right? What the self is actually starts to be questioned. Like, who actually am I? What is witnessing? And it's like this like questioning. Whereas before it's like, this is who I am. This is what I do. This is my identity. This is my personality.
Yeah.
Like everything is like very, very, very rigid.
Yeah.
Um, and she actually paints it as an art. When you're a baby, it's very soft. You don't really know who you are. You develop a very rigid identity as you grow up or as you mature. And then as you continue to mature, then it gets broken down and you're kind of back where you started with this very amorphous, like what actually am I? What is witnessing? What is the self that is, being transcended, and include, you start noticing the process of transcending and including, oh, what is happening as I like transcend and include? That's very interesting. What is happening as, oh, I thought I was this, but that was just another part. Now what is witnessing all of the ecology of parts and
Mhm.
stuff like that?
Mhm.
Feels like, I don't know, to me that feels like kind of the core essence of the developmental process.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, not that kind of we have to go back into that space, but it does make me think for myself that the process of kind of, having my reality distorted, like, is the process on which some of this has some of my own development has played out, because it's been such a
Mm,
huge part of my own development
mhm,
of the last, like, 4 or 5 years. um, and having an intense rigidity about my interpretation of what happened, or about,
right.
uh, who I am and how this changes who I am, and that being a lot of resistance to letting who I am be changed.
Mm,
And then also creating like a new sort of shame-filled identity of this person who let all those bad things happen or whatever. And that
mm,
becoming very rigid. And then starting to, I think, in some sense, the sort of like humility and levity and sort of shadow work integration perspective that is more recent for me is a little bit of like, I mean, I don't know where I am on these things, but like, at least in some narrow dimension, kind of like, well, I don't understand any of that. Um, I don't understand good and bad very. I know under some things about it, but I can kind of accept that it's both not totally relativistic and not totally clear, like who I am or
mm,
what
mm,
happened or these things. There's
right.
not one answer,
Mm,
and I stand that I don't think these things are totally relativistic. And who knows, like
mhm.
there's some kind of form to things. Um, so it's interesting, just as you're describing that, noticing kind of that dance between of yo-yo, and I'll probably keep going back and forth. That's, I mean, maybe it doesn't follow the developmental thing, but
Right. Well, I mean, and then part of one of the core aspects of developmental theories, from all the ones I've studied, it goes like this. It's like a back and forth process, right? It goes individual, collective, or like it's always like the pendulum is swinging one way, then it's swinging back again, slightly higher, but collective, then slightly higher individual. So it's like there's like multiple individuals, but one is more mature, more complex, more inclusive, and it keeps going back and forth. Which
cool.
I still am trying to like fully understand, why does it do that, and I guess, I mean, because if you're gonna go away from one, you're gonna go to the other. It sounds like your
Yeah,
story, leaving the place and going to Colorado. um uh
get some of that in there.
yeah, I see, just being conscious of the time.
Yeah.
I think we had this question kind of in our minds before we talked, but to kind of wrap it up, I'm curious, um leaving this sort of cult dynamic, what was your process of reintegrating back into society?
Oh my
And,
god.
or
Oh my god.
just wherever that, whatever that brings up. I know, a huge question, but
Um, I think I'm still in that process. Um,
mm,
uh, Not in the hot part of it.
mhm,
And again, like my experience leaving this group is different from other people's experiences leaving that group. Not everybody's experiences leaving groups like this in general is going to be the same.
mm,
Oh man, extreme. I mean, extremely transformative, extremely transformative. The most transformative
mm,
thing I've ever gone through. Um, extremely isolating in a lot of ways.
Mm,
Uh, extremely isolating at times. There's definitely a sort of extreme solo journey, places I had to go, things I had to do alone, and then a coming back into relationship.
Do you have
Um,
any stories around why that's the case? Of why it's so isolating to go through the process of reintegration?
yeah, I don't quite have the awareness to know what is unique to me and what's generalizable, but I can speak to it and people can pick apart, in whatever
Perfect.
way.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I think one reason it's isolating is that I had my experiences of extreme badness were stronger earlier than my experiences of the extreme goodness. And I think stronger than a lot of other people who were there. So um, I had like a get all the way away from everything. Even I couldn't even be in the state where this all happened. I mean, I
Mm,
really couldn't for like a year and a half. I
mhm,
couldn't even think about it. I couldn't think about the whole West Coast. like, so there was like an extreme self isolation, partly for safety, um, and then let's see, what I'm gonna say here. Um, I think a lot of what's isolating is that there's not common knowledge about these phenomenon. You try to explain to someone why you're so messed up,
mm.
and they're a little skeezed out. They're like, "You're in a cult? That sounds weird. Are you still in a cult? Like, what do you mean?"
Mm,
Or you try to explain to someone who was there that you're describing it as a cult, and they're like, "I don't think it was a cult," and then that's really invalidating, and that's really
yeah.
isolating and scary.
Mhm,
Um, and and I think you're so far out to mimetic sea, so to speak, because
mm,
you went into an insular mimetic world that most people haven't gone to. So you have all this mimetic content that is a huge part of your experience that you only kind of share with the people who are there.
mhm,
But you also no longer want that really, or something was wrong about that, or I did. I
mm,
knew something was wrong about that for me, and that I didn't want to stay the person I became there. And so you're like, who do I share anything with? I'm too far away from regular society because I left that and went on this weird journey with these other weirdos.
mhm.
And now I'm too far away from the other weirdos, even who I was close with, because something there really hurt me. And so you don't know, yeah, I think you don't know anymore. You don't really share culture with anyone. Really. You
Mm,
share some
mm,
little bits from each world maybe, but, you don't really share culture. So, not to mention the pandemic happened. I mean, it's just circumstantial things. But, I think that's an experience that people who were not in cults can also identify with if they got very deep into any sort of mimetic tribe, even one that wasn't terribly painful, but one that proved imperfectly true. I've often kind of related with people who've gone on long intellectual journeys or emotional kind of ideological journeys over this process of, you know, kind of being unaware, then thinking you found a new truth, then going to that, and
mm,
then realizing that's not true. And then if you're actually going to take that in, you got to leave. And then it's like there's nowhere to go. You have to leave before there's somewhere to go.
mm, mm, mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting the sense if someone is really deep in a mimetic tribe, even ones that are popular,
Yeah.
even ones that have many millions of people following them. It's
Yeah.
like to reconcile leaving is like to leave one's entire network and everyone one interact, like, because if you go deep enough, your entire every single person around you is also in that mimetic tribe.
Yeah.
I'm getting the same feeling of like then you try to interact, you've been so kind of indoctrinated into that to interact with people outside of that mimetic tribe feels almost foreign, is kind of the sense I'm getting.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It's foreign. It feels untrue. Like it feels like there's sheer in the interaction. Like
Mm.
you're faking or something. Like maybe you know the things to
Yeah, yeah.
say. Oh, I used to be woke. I know the woke things to say, but you're like, oh, I'm not really here for this conversation. Like I'm for me, like I'm hiding.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of feeling like hiding. I think that a lot of
Mm,
people experience. Well, that I experience. I can't speak for everyone.
mhm.
Um, Yeah, and then I do think there's this reckoning with what am I losing, and it's not always clear. So it's not always clear what you need to grieve because you
Mm,
don't quite know what the cost is of leaving until you leave. Like there are people who are in big mimetic tribes, like have millions of people, and then they kind of mentally leave, but their family is still there. And
right.
what does this mean for the connection? Is it a total loss or is it a little adjustment? You often don't know to start with. And so there's this kind of meta confusion about what am I even adapting to here? You know,
Mm,
how big is this loss? And like in my case, I think the loss was devastating and almost total in a lot of ways. And then a lot more was able to be rebuilt in terms of individual relationships than I had expected. And I'm still
mm.
learning what that's like, so it tricks you. You don't always know. am I grieving this too early? Like
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
It makes me realize or have compassion for people that grew up in a certain family structure with a very strong mimetic tribe, and then having to grapple with that for the rest of your life. I've heard even heard stories of people, their parents just say, I will never talk to you again, just completely disown them because, oh, you went outside of the mimetic
Yeah.
tribe and the way of doing things. I'm like, that must be so difficult.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it is. I mean, I think it really is. And I have a lot of friends where that's their story in particular. I grew up,
And
extremely close
yeah,
to them or something.
right. And again, this feels like to me like another counterpoint to this sort of second tier game B. We need to get everyone into this space because like a lot of times it's like we're going to demonize people who are like have fundamentalist belief systems because this is a very low stage of development or something. And it's like
Mhm.
I just feel myself called more and more to like, whoa, what are the actual dynamics happening to keep someone in a fundamentalist belief system their whole life? Or
Mhm.
like how strong, like wow, that's some powerful forces, if your family
Yeah.
said they'll disown you if you don't believe in the
Yeah.
fundamentalist version of any religion, it's like,
Yeah.
wow, that's powerful. Like
Yeah.
I feel bad that I used to kind of subtly demonize people that were in
Yeah.
fundamentalist belief systems,
Yeah, it's a very difficult position to be in if you're
Yeah.
someone who has doubt inside of that. I mean, some people probably don't have doubt, but if you're someone who does, it's not an enviable position. It's really not
Mhm.
because again of this thing where basic human needs have been put at odds with each other.
Right.
And so I do think it's a kind of degraded. There are certain principles or dynamics that can make a community a more or less degraded form of community. And I think one dimension along which you can map that is um, like to what extent are basic human needs being sacrificed to be part of the community, right? And this has
Mm.
everything to do with space for multiplicity of experience and viewpoints. Like,
Right.
um, goes back a little bit to a thing you said about like, oh, sometimes it'll seem like you're allowed to protest or be critical thinker, but like actually what happens when you do that, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Does it actually get incorporated? Do you make a dent on the culture? Are you having an impact? Like, are you being blocked in a billion subtle ways when you actually bring a fresh, novel kind of a thought from your inner genius that's like, huh, what if it was like this? Like, is there space
Mhm.
for that?
Yeah.
Because that's part of human thriving. And if that's not allowed, um, that's some amount of cost, and that that dynamic can be made more or less extreme. There's a big spectrum, of course.
Mm, mm. Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate that frame. The that landed as kind of ability to hold space for any perspective and to yeah, have that be heard. Awesome, awesome. Is there anything that's still incomplete or that you want to share before kind of wrapping this up?
Um, Not much. I mean, I think I would say if you're like kind of on a practical note, if you think you're wrapped in sort of a reality distortion field kind of thing, um, give yourself a middle ground. Don't make yourself say yes or no. See if you can find something not binary to transition, maybe
Mm,
transition out, maybe give yourself a little space to integrate
right.
your inner divide that might be happening towards an external object.
Mhm.
Um, and I would say, also, I guess I would just caveat and say these are all based on my personal experiences, and so people should interpret it as such, and none of
Yeah.
it is meant to be total or complete or certain.
Mhm.
It's very much just kind of stuff I came to through my own experience. So to the extent that it's helpful, that's great, and if not, throw it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Always trust your own experience. This is
I guess that's
yeah.
the message, really.
Yeah, I mean, I could second that. Not, it doesn't sound like either of us are experts on anything fully. This is just like, all right, this is what we've discerned from certain experiences that we've had that
Yeah,
have been difficult, and maybe there's some lessons in there. Maybe there's some insights in there that can be taken.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really fun.